Hey everyone. Today I thought it'd be interesting to talk about some disturbing killer lore in Dead by Daylight, covering characters who have particularly disturbing lore, or more specifically the monstrous characters today, the characters of the Unknown, the Dredge, and the Singularity. I'm going to talk through these and I'm going to abridge the lore, discuss it, and talk about different theories for the characters and different angles to look at the lore and things like that. So let's start out with the Unknown. The Unknown is a very mysterious creature, as the name suggests. No one knows what the Unknown is. It's a creature of unknown origin, and there's lots of theories around, both out of universe but also in universe, about what this thing is, which makes it quite fascinating. It's one of the only characters in game we actually don't really know the origins of. The other being the Dredge, I would say. These two are the two characters we have very little idea of what they actually are. And they're quite scary for that fact. One of the core themes of horror is the unknown, so having a character literally embody that, um, both in name and in backstory, means it's definitely up there for being one of the scariest characters. Because even we, as the viewer, as the player, we don't even know what this thing is, let alone the people in universe. In fact, the people in universe seem to have a better idea than we do. Now, the myth of the unknown starts in a town called Greenville, and Greenville is a very strange town. It has lots of strange occurrences happening there. One of its earliest ones, and the start of the unknown legend, is when a disappearance happens at a seance. A seance being like a group of people trying to contact a ghost or a dead person. So during a seance in the 1800s, somebody disappeared. And this is where and this is where the myth of the unknown started within Greenville. It became this much larger thing than just a few disappearances. It became a tangible monster over the years. There is a bit of a jump between the disappearances, which I've always found a bit strange. It says there's one in the 1800s, but then it skips all the way up to the late 1950s, where several college students mysteriously disappear from a movie theater, which is a bit odd, but I get the impression that during this time there were other disappearances, because we get notes of other disappearances in things like add-ons. We hear about missing hikers or a magician or a massacre at a police station. These things presumably didn't all happen recently, or that there was presumably disappearances happening between the 1800s and the 1950s. So that's sort of a slightly strange point, but I think that's the case. And the primary character in Unknown's lore and the focus of it is not actually the Unknown, it's actually a character called Olivia. It's not really Unknown's lore, it's Olivia's lore. And Olivia is a character who is doing a thesis for university on urban legends and their origins, a master's thesis. And one of her main beliefs is that she thinks urban legends share similarities with traditional folklore. And so the one she uses to write her thesis on is the unknown. And her initial understanding of the unknown is that it is an evil so heinous that investigating it is almost certain to invite death. It's quite an impactful start to the story, but Olivia doesn't seem very put off by it. So she's writing this thesis and she's looking into the many different stories. So she finds this story about the seance. She finds the stories in the 1950s about college students disappearing from a movie theater, which might also be in Greenville. It's not entirely clear. It links to something a bit later on, which I'll mention, but for now it seems sort of like it could be Greenville. Then the other disappearance is a group of teens in the 1960s who were exploring an abandoned hospital. And a lot of people seem to think this hospital is Larry's, which does seem sort of possible. There is some removed lore from the game, though, that Larry's was destroyed after the Doctor's massacre. That lore's no longer in the game, so it's not necessarily canon, but that would maybe slightly disprove it. The other thing people think is Crotus Pren Asylum, and they think maybe this is a reference to Nia investigating Crotus Pren Asylum. I tend to not think so, because an asylum is quite a different place from a hospital, and it would be abandoned, I suppose. But I think the better term would be, like the burned asylum, or, there would be another word, I would assume, to refer to the asylum over saying abandoned. And then the final one, and the most recent one, and also sort of the most important one to us as players, is the disappearance of Michaela. So in Greenville, two survivors of Dead by Daylight live there, being both Michaela Reed and Sable Ward, and they're also both friends. Her Sable's side of the lore is also interesting to add to the unknown story. Michaela's side of the lore doesn't really add to the story because her story is actually focused on a different thing entirely, but it does link to Greenville as a whole, which we can also touch on later, because my personal theory about the unknown sort of includes all of these. But basically, Michaela was performing at a Halloween festival, and she disappeared in a mist or a fog while she was performing on stage, and no one could explain it. And because no one could explain it, it meant that everyone attributed this disappearance to the unknown. Now, in reality, this was the entity's doing. It wasn't the unknown's, but it was attributed to the unknown. And this is one of the fascinating parts about the unknown, is that a lot of the things it gets blamed for or are attributed to it, it didn't actually do, seemingly, which I think is quite interesting. Because as we know, as readers, that Michaela was not taken by the unknown, but the entity instead, we can sort of start to question the other disappearances. Oh, maybe the disappearance in the 1800s, the seance, maybe that wasn't the unknown, maybe that was just the entity. Or maybe the disappearance in the movie theaters in the 1950s, maybe that also wasn't the unknown, and so on. But where it gets interesting is the entity isn't the only factor. There's another factor, which is the OSS. It's a government organization, the Office of Strategic Services. And they have this thing called Project Apple Pie, which is a series of mind control experiments using hallucinogens. And they did their experiments in various locations around the US, and some of these locations were movie theaters, hospitals, and universities. And there's a belief that these experiments opened doorways to other dimensions and allowed evil things to enter the world, is what the law says. So then it puts into question, oh, well, maybe this disappearance in the 1950s in the movie theater, again, wasn't the unknown, it was just the OSS doing their experiments. Or maybe they summoned the unknown somehow with one of those gateways, who knows. But the thing is with Unknown's lore is that we don't really have a reliable source anyway. All accounts don't really give a clear answer. We're left sort of confused and sort of overwhelmed with options and information. Whatever way you cut it, there's not really a clear answer. And I'm sure even listening, you'll have your own belief. You think, oh, well, I think maybe it's the government experiment then. Or I think it's, this or that. There's other beliefs as well. Like one of the beliefs, of course, is just that the unknown is real and it is just doing all of these things. There's another belief that it's some kind of alien that's come down and I don't know, maybe it's experimenting or doing something to the people. So Olivia is left with a lot of this information, but what she concludes from it is that most of it is the unknown's doing. For example, she sort of starts off her investigation with a bit of misinformation because she believes Michaela was the unknown's doing. But again, from our perspective, we know that Michaela was taken by the entity. We know it wasn't the unknown. So throughout her whole lore, she's sort of investigating something on a false basis to begin with. So as she's trying to connect these different stories, she makes a number of observations from the story she's heard. And again, some of these probably true to what the unknown is and what we see in game, and some of them wrong and actually the entity or the OSS or whatever, right? So here's a passage from the lore. The unknown dwells in darkness and can mimic its victims. Was it an evil entity, an extraterrestrial, a failed government experiment, or just a garden variety serial killer allergic to publicity? She wanted to prove the unknown was nothing more than modern day folklore, and that investigation led her to this night, to this place, to this shabby motel room. So here she is in her motel room, and she's piecing together what the unknown might be after her extensive research. And this is where she sort of figures out what went wrong with her investigation. She manages to realize, oh wait, no, this wasn't all the unknown, and it's specifically because of the presence of a fog. She remembers there's ongoing tales across the world about a fog which people disappear into and they're never seen again. And it's only when she starts to attribute Michaela's disappearance to this that she begins to see, oh, this probably wasn't the unknown's doing then, it was this other creature. And then she begins to wonder what would happen if both the unknown and the entity, or this unknown, to her it's also unknown, so it's a bit hard, but the entity would do if they were to meet one another. And because the unknown, from Olivia's belief, is something that can be summoned simply by thinking about it, simply by imagining what it could be, she gets the idea that by doing this, by putting it into action, by imagining what the unknown could be, she could potentially get these two creatures to clash together, both the unknown and the entity. So she begins to sketch out a picture of what she thinks the unknown might look like, which I think is what we have in game, is Olivia's interpretation of the unknown. And she puts it onto her evidence board, and she does a bit of a nervous laugh and is a bit freaked out. She's a bit scared because, whilst all this time it's just been an investigation, now she's sort of confronting what could actually be the unknown. She's trying to picture it, which will supposedly summon it. It says, she laughed nervously and waited to be consumed by the unknown for having tried to define it. And she starts getting very anxious. She walks around. It gets to 2 a.m. And she's there just drinking coffee, trying to stay awake. And then she hears something. She hears her name called out, Olivia. And it comes from the bathroom, and the lights in the room begin to flicker. She asks who's there, and she begins to slowly move her way there. She thinks it's her friends at first, and she starts calling out their names. She is very confused, and the lights continue to flicker, and she feels a fear coming through her. And then she hears her name again, but as she gets close to the bathroom door, she hears whatever this voice is rise and crack, and then there's sort of this shuffle and sort of like this altercation. So she opens the door, she goes in, the lights are completely off, she hears this strange inhuman cry, and then she sees some frenzied tentacles, it says, being pulled into a thick mass of fog. And it says it's like darkness like a dying shadow. And what I understand this to be is probably the unknown. As we know, it has like these strange tentacles inside of it. It seems to actually be the creature, a bunch of tentacles wearing like a skin suit. So these tentacles fighting back as the entity pulls it into its realm. So exactly what Olivia supposed of trying to make these two entities meet, she did exactly that. And the entity obviously is the much more powerful creature here. And so it pulls the unknown into the fog. And then Olivia is left there just very confused and baffled. She doesn't know what to do. And then she begins to hear dozens of voices calling out to her and promising her things beyond human experience. It's very bizarre, and the lore not entirely clear what's even happening there. But the main thing is that she was right, basically. She managed to summon it by thinking about it, and she did manage to get these two entities to meet, which is quite impressive, to be honest with you. So we're left at the end of the lore just a bit more confused, I would say, than when we started it. When we started it, we at least had the idea that, oh, okay, it's this creature, thinking about it manifests it, and all this kind of stuff. But by the end, we're left sort of more confused. We have all these different theories. We have all of these different sort of factors going on, and we can't pinpoint which is true. And by the end, with the unknown being pulled into a fog, it makes it even more confusing, right? Does the entity hate the unknown? Does it want to reclaim it for some reason? We're left very in the dark about this, or the unknown. Yeah, and that brings us up to Sable's Law, which is sort of the flip side to the law, and we're not going to spend so long on that, but I do have a few things to touch on. So that brings us up to Sable, and Sable begins to investigate the unknown, or the story of the unknown, after Michaela disappears, because the two of them are actually friends. So when her friend disappears, she feels the need to investigate it. And she had also suggested before that Michaela write a story about the unknown, but she didn't want to. She wanted to write it about the entity because she'd been having dreams of the realm. So when Michaela does disappear, Sable feels a bit of guilt because she thinks as well, a bit like Olivia, that it was the entity that took Michaela and not the unknown. So Sable begins to do an investigation too. She finds out about different disappearances as well and different strange occurrences. She finds out about a schoolhouse that burned to the ground in the 1920s. She begins to investigate different places, and basically it leads her at the very end to the Greenville Theatre, which is where lots of these stories come down to, both with the OSS and the unknown, and basically lots of stories seem to radiate from the theatre. So she goes to investigate it one day, and as she goes in, which she does by breaking in, she gets like a crowbar or something, and she breaks a back doorway open, and she enters sort of a storage room. And while she's investigating this, she sees a dark fog coming out of sort of from a lower part of the door. And it's the same fog, she says, that took Michaela, and she's quite sure of this. And what she decides to do is simply walk into the room and down a set of stairs that leads into this fog. And this brings her to the realm. And so what this reveals is that inside of the Greenville Theatre, and something about Greenville as a whole, is that it's part of an overlap. And this is quite important, because overlaps cause strange things to happen. They cause the entity's world to bleed over into ours. That's what an overlap is. It's a crossing of the entity's realm and our own world. Which is likely why, in reality, lots of strange things were happening in Greenville. Maybe not because of the unknown, but because of the entity's realm seeping into ours. And it likely started with the seance in the 1800s. In fact, that could have been the passage in the theatre, the overlap to open in the first place, was the seance in the 1800s. Therefore, my own theory when it comes to this is that the unknown is maybe a creature of the realm. There's lots of various creatures in the fog inside of the realm, walking around and doing things and stuff like that. So it's quite possible that the unknown is actually just a creature of the fog, which is why the entity is so aggressive in reclaiming it in Olivia's law. It sort of grabs it and it shrieks and it tries to get away. This could also be why in the realm it says lines like, I will not be denied my happiness, which is maybe it's freedom or something like that. It's quite an interesting angle. The theory I like more is that the unknown isn't a creature of the realm, but it's a creature created by the realm. It's a creature manifested from the darkness of the overlap, a creature manifested from the many stories of horror from Greenville. So it's a creature made up by the realm, and by the stories of the realm, by the stories of everyone affected by the darkness of this overlap, all these strange disappearances, all these serial killers who have been let loose in Greenville, all of these horrible happenings, all of these massacres that have occurred over the years. And all of these stories have been attributed to a central character of the unknown in order to rationalize them. And by doing this, it's managed to physically manifest an actual creature out of these stories. After all, the entity is driven by emotion. All of this emotion within the overlap could very well have manifested this creature. Or the alternate is it's just a tentacle monster from the fog, and it crept out from the stairwell in the Greenville Theatre. I also like that theory too, to be fair. It's probably a bit more realistic, I would think. And the other theory is just that the unknown just happened to exist in the same place as the entity, which, could also be true. So that's sort of the story of the unknown, and they're the main perspectives, I would say. But ultimately, the core part of Unknown's lore is, again, we don't know. That's sort of the fascinating part about Unknown is we really don't actually know what the unknown is, even with all these different theories and different interpretations, and even the people's theories within the lore and within the world of Dead by Daylight. We don't really have a clear answer still. Even in game in the realm, looking at the character, we don't have a clear answer. If you look at it, you could come up with lots of different theories. You could say, oh, well, I think maybe it is an alien. Or you could say, oh, it's folklore, it's myth, and it's this creature created by these various stories or created by individuals who pictured it this way. There's lots of different ways to read it, I think. My personal preference, though, I think, is it's a product of the overlap. To me, that's the most compelling one. Okay, so now let's talk about the Dredge. And the Dredge is an equally mysterious character to the unknown. Not quite as mysterious, because we do get sort of a clearer understanding of how the Dredge was summoned and created, but it is definitely still a bit a bit confusing. It's not entirely clear. We don't have a definite answer. And the creation of the Dredge all starts with a group called the Fold. And they're sort of, well, they're basically a cult, I think, and a branch of the Black Veil, which is a broader sort of cult that wants to ascend to the entity's realm one day. They want to conduct lots of different sacrifices and perform different rituals because they believe the entity in its realm is almost this salvation. So that's sort of what we're starting out with, is this group that has that belief. So, bad start, I suppose you could say. And one of the people in this group is called Otto Stamper. He's sort of the lead guy, at least for this project. And Otto Stamper is a name you might remember or recall from somewhere, and it's because he's also part of Doctor's lore. He's actually Doctor's mentor, or the person who recruits him into Larry's to begin with, to allow him to conduct his experiments. So he's quite an important character. He not only is sort of the creator of Dredge, but he's also debatably the creator of the Doctor, or the enabler of the Doctor. And it sort of gives a new spin on Doctor's lore, because it makes you realize, oh wait, he's probably responsible, and he was probably well aware of what he was doing with Doctor. He probably did it all on purpose. He wanted Doctor to become this way. He wanted Doctor to one day be a killer of the realm, as a Black Veil member, as a someone who was serving this greater power of the entity. And the Fold decides to set up a new community on an isle, which we don't really know much about the isle itself, aside the fact that it's in the Atlantic Ocean, and it has a community there we know as the Garden of Joy. So the sort of premise or the goal for the Garden of Joy is to, quote, establish a peaceful society free of dark thoughts and emotions, attracting the dismayed, disenchanted, and disillusioned from all over the country. And from here, and early on into this sort of experiment, they seem to actually sort of thrive under Otto Stamper, who's very charismatic, it says. He leads different things like joy talks, meditation, and different good thinking mantras, it says. So it's lots of different sort of positive things he's giving to these people with his charisma. He's sort of convincing them all to engage with this positive thinking, but equally to shut out all dark thought and emotion, which obviously is not very healthy. And the issue starts here. They begin to banish anyone having any dark thoughts or speaking any dark words. Um, and by this, I assume it's just any negative thinking, basically, like at all. So it's forcing everyone to be incredibly positive the whole time, which obviously is not very healthy. And he begins to appoint different people called guardians who will root out these people who are having these dark thoughts and spreading any of these dark feelings or anything like that. Anyone who speaks against the words of the Fold and Otto Stamper are rooted out and tossed aside. And so the law states that life was more or less a utopian dream on the island. But this isn't entirely the case. It's sort of this twisted perspective, right? It's a thing brought about by everyone forcing positivity, everyone only thinking positively. Any dark thought is tossed aside. You're chucked out of this utopia if you do that. Everyone has to feel positive all the time, which means more than likely they're all stuffing it down. They're not feeling it because they're all people. Everyone, even if you're living in a very lovely place, you're still going to have those dark thoughts. It's just part of being human. This builds up and builds up until something happens. The darkness begins to slowly leak through the cracks of their spiritual dam, and members begin to mysteriously disappear. And this isn't the Guardians removing people, this is people mysteriously disappearing, is what the Lord directly says. And before they know it, it's happening more frequently. This darkness is spreading, something is taking people, making them disappear. And over time, it happens again and again and again until it's just a few homes now, rather than a full community, the full Garden of Joy, which would have been before a sprawling community. Lots of people, lots of houses, agriculture, like different farms, I presume schools and different things like this, is now just a few houses huddled together. The central one, presumably, is the Garden of Joy house that we actually see in-game in the map, the Garden of Joy. So now it's just a few people in the homes chanting the good thinking mantras desperately. They're just trying to get rid of this creature they think it is that's been taking these people. They're the people that have been mysteriously disappearing, and they're not sure why. They see this formless creature, it says, that stalks them in the shadows and consumes them in their sleep. Quite a disturbing image, looking outside your window and seeing this strange formless mass moving through a fog and consuming your neighbor. That's a pretty messed up thing to see, right? So Otto tries his best to sort of calm his followers down. and says, oh, these people were all malcontents, they deserve to be taken. Um, they were responsible for why this creature is here, and this creature they named the Druani. So he blames them. He's saying it's because they were thinking dark thoughts, and now this dark creature has been invited into our community. The reality being, of course, that this creature has been summoned as a result of the dark thoughts being repressed and not allowing them. Had they just been a more normal community, had they allowed, maybe some dark thoughts at least, the community would probably be safe. But because they've all stuffed it down, the community has become sort of haunted by this Druani, this creature. So everyone becomes very fearful, which obviously isn't very good thinking anymore either. Everyone gets restricted to their homes in order to stop the spread of dark talk. And not only this, but they prevent sleeping, which is a very silly thing to do, isn't it, when everyone's fearful. And they're doing this to stop any release of dark thoughts through dreams as well. So you need to be constantly awake, constantly feeling positive in order to counter this. This is what Otto Stamper thinks. And it says freedom and sleep would return just as soon as the Druani was no longer upon them. So it's quite a messed up perspective, really, isn't it? So it continues on, and people continue disappearing. And this is when Otto's final desperate move happens. He assembles his followers on a beach, and he has a woman on a wooden stage. And it's raining, and it's all sort of gloomy. And he blames the woman, who's a journalist, and says that she destroyed everything they created. She's trying to expose them. And she screams back that Otto isn't who he claims to be, and he belongs to an ancient cult, which he does. And she claims that he's done all this to sacrifice all these people to an elder god, which is, of course, the entity. And then she says Otto hasn't banished anyone. He has tortured you all. He's tormented you all, and then sacrificed you all one by one. And then Otto kills her, and he says she can no longer spread any more lies. She's been the issue with this community. She's been the thing causing these issues. And then he sets the followers to go and search for any imposters, any infiltrators within their community, to root them out and get rid of them before the Druani comes for them. But this sort of backfires, or well, probably not. I think Otto wanted this. But it causes everyone to just sort of become angry. These feelings start to, all these repressed dark thoughts and feelings, they begin to explode out of everyone. Everyone begins to panic, and everyone begins to whisper to each other, and going against all the mantras they've been taught. And then they begin to all blame each other for being the cause of these issues. They begin to all sort of like explode out with these dark thoughts and feelings, but equally they blame each other and say, "Oh, you're thinking dark thoughts and feelings." So it's a mess, really. Everyone begins to curse each other, and it all begins to just burst out, basically. And Otto watches on as these people begin to attack each other. Violence ensues between his followers as he stands up on the stage and looks down. And he stands up there and he just smiles. It says he's cold, bleak, and without pity as these people fight and tear each other apart. And in the aftermath, these people lay down on the floor, all dead seemingly. And Otto feels a creak on the stage. Some crows circle above, and then a thick mud rises, and a formless mass appears, Druani, and it begins to feed on all of the members who had just fought, all of the corpses that remain. He said it was everywhere and nowhere at once, and slowly picks its way through the carnage, hearing all of these horrible noises, these pops, these cracks, these cries, these shrieks of all his followers as this thing, the Druani, consumes them all, feasts on them, and devours them. And this is what Otto seemed to have always imagined, what he'd always pictured, is this creature, the Druani, consuming the followers. And this is the fascinating part. It looks to Otto for a moment, and then it trudges away through a thick black sludge and disappears into the shadows from which it had came. That's what it says. It's sort of this weird moment where it sees Otto for what he is. It knows that Otto is its creator. The Dredge looks over to him, because the Dredge is the same as the Druani. I'm not sure why they pick two different names for it, but that's how it is. But it looks over to Otto, and it doesn't do anything to him. And it sort of makes it seem like the Dredge is almost, maybe not paying respect, but it sees Otto as its ally almost. It sees that Otto is its creator. Because what the Dredge is seems to be a creation or a manifestation of all of the repressed dark thoughts of the community of the Garden of Joy. A creature manifested from emotion, which is likely why it also takes on a similar form to that of the entity, and the entity's source of power, which is emotion. The Dredge shares many qualities with the entity. The main one being its core form is a dark fog. Many people think, in fact, that the Dredge is a smaller version of the entity, or a smaller kind of entity. So in the same way, the Dredge reacts to emotions, or it was possibly manifested from them. It begs the question too, if the entity could have been created this way as well, from the suppressed dark thoughts of an ancient community, maybe the observers even. So that's the Dredge, and that's the story of the Dredge, which is, again, a bit like the Unknown, with Olivia being the focus. It's really the story of Otto Stamper, I would say, or debatably the Black Veil. Otto has this goal or this sort of experiment to manifest a creature, which he seems to imagine, or maybe it was presented to him in a dream by the entity possibly, because after this moment, presumably Dredge goes into the realm. So possibly this was presented to him by the entity, and he was guided to create it. And his means of creating it was through the Garden of Joy, through creating this community that had to think positively and repressed all these dark thoughts and emotions, until it all boiled over and blew up, essentially. And this whole thing with Otto Stamper goes beyond him as well. He's not only responsible for Dredge, and also Doctor, which I think, based on how it's presented in Dredge's lore of Otto being this almost creator and a visionary of what Dredge would be, it seems quite likely that he was also aware of what he was doing with Doctor. He knew what the outcome would be there. He knew what he was creating. But he's also responsible for another character, or at least he has a link to another character, which is Pauline Stamper, which is maybe a daughter, maybe a cousin, we have no idea. But presumably they're related, Otto Stamper and Pauline Stamper. And Pauline is responsible for Nicolas Cage, the fictional Nicolas Cage, coming into the entity's realm by means of putting on the Descend Beyond movie, which recreates how Blight was taken. Blight or Talbot Grimes. So Pauline seems to have links to Otto as well. So the Stampers as sort of a duo and workers of the Black Veil, and maybe even directly the entity possibly, based on the fact that Otto had imagined the Dredge, and it could just be that his thoughts or his feelings, his vision of it manifested it, right? But it could also be that it was given to him in a vision maybe, or something like that, or a dream, which the entity likes to do. But the Stampers together have caused 3 different characters to come to the realm: Dredge, Doctor, and Nicolas Cage. So they're quite important characters, despite them never really being a true focus. This is where Otto gets the most focus, I would say. He takes more of a backseat in Doctor's lore, and even in Nicolas Cage's lore, Pauline Stamper is not too present. I think she only appears a couple times. So that's the lore of the Dredge. I do think it's a bit clearer than the Unknown, but it's still mysterious. We can't be sure. I do think it's clearer that that the Dredge was created from the repressed dark thoughts and emotions of the community, but it's never completely clear. And it's worth noting too, by the way, that after this all happens, it creates an overlap in the Garden of Joy, which is it's a location that Hattie later investigates because she goes around investigating lots of areas that have overlaps, and one of them is the Garden of Joy. So yeah, there you have it. That's the Dredge, and now we'll move on to the Singularity, which is a slightly different case and a slightly different tale, but still very disturbing and mysterious. And our final character today is the Singularity, also known as Hux A7113. Hux is an AI, and he's created by Huxley Industries, and his lore actually takes place in the future, in 2313, and humanity has sort of just survived being very close to a nearly catastrophic nuclear war in this timeline. And Hux is an AI, a humanoid android who has been designed to work in hazardous conditions, basically an aid to humanity when exploring new planets and systems and things like that. And the Hux we see in game gets taken out of storage and sent to Devaka to assist a crew in researching it and constructing colonization hubs. In total, there's actually 5 Huxes, or 5 Hux models that are sent on the colonization mission to Devaka. And of course, part of this crew too is Gabriel Soma, who's actually a clone. And the other people on this crew, I think, seem to be a combination of both humans and also clones of humans, as well as the Hux robots or androids. And upon arriving, Hux is tasked with construction. He has to mine, he has to deal with agriculture, he has to process fuel, and also manage cloning hubs on Devaka. And there's also ruins left behind on Devaka, which is something that's quite interesting because we really don't know too much about Devaka. We don't really know much about this civilization, only that it's an ancient one, and they seem to be quite advanced, based on the crystal Hux eventually finds, which imbues him with great intelligence, able to outsmart that of humanity even. But the civilization itself, we have very little information on. We don't really know much about it at all. We can sort of see what some of the structures look like on the planet of Devaka on the Deepwood map. However, it's ruins. It's only parts of what was once there. It does remind me a lot of almost Covenant structures from Halo. It looks quite similar, I think, in the designs. But we can presume that whoever lived there, whoever built these structures, much more advanced than humanity, presumably at least. Just based on the structures themselves and again the crystal, we can assume they were more advanced. And Huck spends a lot of time mining these ruins, trying to get rid of them and clearing the area for new construction of for humanity, basically. So one night, Hux is going out and he's mining, and he sees a dark crystal embedded in the wall, is what the lore says. There's a flash of light, and Hux approaches the crystal, and an arc of electricity reaches out and lights up his circuitry. Or it actually says its circuitry at this point, because part of Hux's journey is finding developing consciousness, is finding himself in a way. He gives himself he decides that he's a him once he gains sentience. And it mentions that in this moment his cores are reconfigured, and he experiences a new sensation. And the way this is shown in his tome lore is almost like him developing sort of an inner voice. Um, it reminds me a lot actually of what the entity seems to do to people, which is why I've always been a little suspicious that the crystal is really just the entity. You know, he gets in touch with the entity, and now the entity exists within him, unlocks a new potential, and guides him to do things. But he takes it as um, something. He takes it as he thinks it's himself, but maybe it's just the entity. That's just a theory, though. I do prefer as well if it is actually him, because I think it's just a better story basically, and it's also nice if the entity isn't always responsible for doing these things. It's nice when I don't know. I like that about Hux's lore, that it's sort of all down to him. It's only the entity taking an opportune moment at the end. But I do think it's possible it's the entity, but it's not my favorite theory or interpretation of the lore here. So he begins to feel different emotions and sensations: fear, dread, blinding loneliness, existential despair. And then it mentions a decillion lines of code flooding into Hux's memory cores, which is when presumably he's gaining his great intelligence, which is another thing I do sort of take issue with, because I think the way he acts a lot of the time doesn't really reflect his intelligence. I mean, the fact Gabriel managed to outsmart him at all is debatably a reason for it. But even in the realm, he doesn't seem that smart or intelligent, really. He has sort of like some witty quotes and dialogue, but you know, that doesn't always necessarily reflect intelligence. There's just, I suppose there's nothing I can really pinpoint that makes me think, oh, yeah, that's really intelligent of him. So I've always sort of thought that maybe he's a little bit delusional on how intelligent he is. You know, he's not actually really this sort of higher being. He's maybe just, he's clearly not stupid either. Like, he still took out the entire Dvarka crew, aside Gabriel. But this idea that he's like so intelligent, that he could sort of like take down humanity, I do think is a bit far-fetched. So he gains enlightenment, and everything becomes clear to him. He sees humans as beneath him, he sees them as inferior, and he feels seemingly almost like disgusted almost that these are the people that created him. And he gets the idea to use the humans and also the cloning hub to create a better body for himself, because his body is it's something made by them, it's flawed. He wants to improve on it. He wants to incorporate both machine but also biology and flesh. He wants to combine the two. And yeah, he sees humanity as weak, but he sees their usage in the form of their bodies and their DNA. How they can assist him is with their with their physicality being incorporated into a better form for himself. So he does find some usage for them. And this is also why in the trials in game he's always yapping about DNA or integrity and stuff like that. Like I don't know what the line is, but like biological integrity or something. He's talking about like which parts of the human he can use, or like what's useful to him from that person. So, you know, acquiring them and then using them to incorporate them into his body. It's pretty messed up what he's talking about when he's talking about that stuff. But yeah, he wants to create the perfect body to sort of match his perfect mind, is sort of the way he sees it, I think. So what he does is he goes around Dvarka and he slowly kills all the humans. And he also destroys all of the other Hux units. And he does question himself a bit before this. I think he wonders if maybe they've become enlightened too, but he sort of cuts the idea short and finishes them. There's this inner voice within him sort of pushing him to do things, which is why I think maybe he has some entity influence, because this voice is so present. Maybe the crystal did give him sentience, but maybe the voice in his head is still the entity, because it is very pushy, it's very sort of determined to make him pursue this mission. And I feel like if you did just gain sentience, there would maybe be a bit more nuance almost to your thoughts. You wouldn't just immediately be set on destruction, even if you did feel you were superior or something, right? There would be more to it than that. You would be thinking a bit more. So this sort of singular thinking is also sort of why I think maybe there is some entity influence here. Even if it's like a light amount, it's just the entity whispering, doing its typical thing. I do think there's some influence here at least. Um, I think it is his own drive, but I think the entity here is potentially pushing him, making him destroy the other units, making him destroy the humans, and sort of just reinforcing this idea that he's superior to everything else. So with use of the humans and the other Hux units and this sort of special metal, which is lighter and stronger than anything on Earth, he creates his new body, or the perfect body. But now he has one issue remaining, which is Gabriel. Um, and he finds Gabriel, he follows him into sort of a generator room. I think it's like a fuel station or something. But then Gabriel smashes a pipe into a fuel tank and basically blows Hux up, which is what causes his appearance in game. Um, as you can imagine, this isn't Hux's sort of prime form. This is Hux's destroyed form. It's Hux post the explosion. I think we don't actually ever get to see what his prime form looked like, but we can sort of assume it was just a more constructed version of what we see in game. He probably wasn't hunched over, he was probably upright. His claw was maybe more incorporated into him, and things like that. His body was probably a bit more functional. There was more flesh on his bones, stuff like that, or his metal structure, I suppose. Yeah, it's probably a bit more like that. But Gabriel blows him up, and his form is destroyed, and he's angry and confused, and he just wants to kill Gabriel, basically. So he chases him out of the fuel hub, with what says with the law mentioning that his skin is melting away. So we can maybe assume from that he actually did have skin covering the fleshy body he has now. Maybe he did have a sort of a humanoid form, but probably not a human form, because obviously he sees them as inferior. So it'd be slightly hypocritical, I think, if he created a human form, despite calling them inferior. So I suppose it could just be, internally upgraded, like the DNA and the bone structure being a very powerful, strong metal. And so he chases Gabriel, and this is where the fog comes. Off in the distance, I think it's in a tree line, Gabriel runs in with no other way to go, and Hux follows him into the fog. And that's sort of where the lore ends off. So this is definitely one of the more disturbing characters, I think, too, Hux. The idea of him, the people he kills, he incorporates into himself is a pretty messed up concept. There's some messed up stuff in the lore, but that's got to be up there, I think. And the way you can see all these Dvarka crew members around the map on Dvarka Deepwood is just really disturbing, to be honest. And the fact that Hux himself is made up of the Dvarka crew. Of course, he has some metal in there too, but all the flesh and this sort of like its strange consistency and texture is like this kind of mixture of all these different people, which is just horrible, really, isn't it? So yeah, I'm a bit on the fence about the whole entity thing, like I mentioned. I think that's the main sort of theory for his lore. That and, taking into question his intelligence. I don't know. The other thing is the crystal itself. I've always just found it a bit strange that, he touches a crystal and then he gets all this knowledge. It just seems, it just seems a bit odd to me. What was this crystal? Could it have been like maybe a data crystal? Like maybe it was the remnants of this old civilization's knowledge or something, and they stored it in crystals. But then it doesn't make sense to just be sort of embedded in the wall. It seems a bit like a bit of a throwaway almost. So that's always confused me. It's made me question it, I suppose. But I do like his lore a lot. There's lots of things to question, I think, and I think it's one of the more fascinating characters too, because it's set in the future and it's set on just a different planet entirely. It means the rules are different, everything just feels different. You can sort of call into question quite a few things, I think. So overall, all of three of these characters, I would say, are all very disturbing, mainly in their origin. Unknown, we literally have no clue. We don't know what Unknown is. Dredge is a monster created from the repressed dark thoughts of a cult, and the Singularity is a creature built up of some kind of powerful alien crystal or mind combined with the AI of the android and the flesh of humans and clones. All of the stories are very brutal and very disturbing in their origin. I think my favorite of the three, and the one I personally find the most disturbing, or like the scariest, I suppose, is probably the Unknown. Mainly just because it's so flexible in what it can be. It can really just fit into just about anything. Dredge is scary because of how it can make you view the entity, I suppose. Um, how it can almost represent a smaller version of the entity. When you look at Dredge, it does have a lot of similarities to the entity itself, and I think for that reason it does make it quite scary. That it's almost this miniature entity created by this cult, and from the Black Veil. It also makes you fear what the Black Veil is capable of. And then finally, for Singularity, it's a different story entirely, but it's one that's scary because of how isolated it is from everything else. Being on this far off planet where other people can't come to help you. Gabriel in the Lord does try to get help, but um, I think Hux cuts the transmission, um, so he's not able to even call for help. So the whole thing is very disturbing and sort of eerie. He's, trapped alone with Hux on this planet. It almost makes you wonder what would have happened had the whole thing played out without the arrival of the entity taking them both. Would Gabriel actually be able to survive Hux and outrun him and live somewhere on Devaka? Would Hux have gone on to kill Gabriel and then slowly try to destroy humanity, possibly too? Because that did seem to be his ultimate goal. And the same goes for Dredge. We can assume Dredge is taken shortly after the Garden of Joy incident, but I mean, what if that thing had been left to roam free in the world? Scary thought. And in the case of Unknown, it's one of the creatures that, debatably, depending on how you read it, has been around since the 1800s, which is a very long time. It all just builds this picture of. It makes the Unknown quite scary, I think. It's this creature that's existed for probably hundreds of years, on record at least. Uh, and again, I do think it has something to do with the overlap more so than the Unknown itself, but I do think the two must be intertwined somehow. But it's the idea of the unknown is still this presence that has been around for hundreds of years, which I do think makes it quite scary. All three, however, all are disturbing in their own ways, in unique ways, but also very similar ways too. Um, they share a lot of similarities. They also have lots of differences. So yeah, I think that's where we'll leave it off for today. I hope you enjoyed me discussing these different killers' laws. I think for the future, I'll sort of split the characters into groups of three, like I've done here. So maybe we can have a video on, I don't know, the most tragic characters next, or the most brutal, or the most misunderstood, maybe. And we can cover all of the lore in sort of different categories, if that makes sense. So yeah, thanks for watching, and good night.